because it might not be GOPP role to be able to do all of this. Some of it might be in the local councils, some of it is NGO role, and so on. But when you are aware, you see yourself in the broader picture, and some of it is within your role, not all of it. So that's one point I wanted to clarify, following on your earlier question. Yes, sure. You want to ask John a question?
In here, John explained about the internal resources and external resources. Talking about when we can use these resources as a starting point, can we start with internal resources as a starting point, or can we use this amount of resources we need here and then we start with our outsourcing?
We've seen different sequences. I think the major lesson for us has been that communities build themselves much more powerfully if the majority of their attention at the beginning of the process is what do we have here and how do we mobilize it.
Sometimes it's not true. Maybe the community is not effective enough to run their own resources, so I have to give them some kind of push first, and then...
No, I think that's exact. Sometimes there may be providing some incentive at the startup, right? To sort of jump start the motor, something like that, right? Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let me, I had promised that I'll come back to this broader question of where that physical capital was. And I, believe it or not, it's just at this point that my slides just arrived from New York. That envelope, I had somehow forgotten these slides, and my very able assistant ensured that it's not some DHL or something and arrived. But in the SL approach, more broadly speaking, when we apply the assets approach to sustainable, when we apply the assets approach that John was talking about to a sustainable livelihoods program, we have used this kind of chart for the as a checklist to look at all the assets, the whole asset base. So we talk about human capital, and that's one kind of asset. The typical thing when you want to remember what human capital is the individual. And John talked about the individual risk and all those issues. And then the social capital, and I think that's what he talked about both as institutions, voluntary institutions, and the whole range of other institutions. So the governance structure, community and other. Which sometimes people think that becomes more important in rural areas than it is in urban areas. But it's not necessarily so. Because you might know that UNDP, I'm sure others have done it, UNDP has a book on urban agriculture. In Cairo, there might, if you check, you will find a lot of agriculture where people produce things. So the natural capital is the other set of assets. And then the physical, human-made, long ago it used to be called man-made, right? But we know now that women have made a lot of this capital. So it's, if you like, physical and economic or human-made. Now I have arranged this transparency like this because it also leads us to the question of sustainability. You see what happens here is when you convert natural capital to human capital, depending on how you do it, you could end up with a non-sustainable process. And the classic example that I have used is, I come from a country in which there's lots of forests in Guyana, in South America, near the Amazon. So we always thought we build houses by wood. Most of our houses are wooden houses. So the example I would use is, if you cut down the forest and you build a house, you have converted one form of capital, natural capital, to physical capital. So as far as the economist is concerned, you still have the same amount of capital. You have merely converted one form to another form. You have not consumed the capital. If you had chopped the forest down and burnt it for firewood, you have consumed your capital. But when you transform it and you build a house, you still have another form of capital. So you have the same amount of capital. And something is sustainable when the capital base is not reduced. The whole principle of sustainability is to live off the interest not to eat your capital. You know, like in a bank account. If you keep your capital fixed and you only draw the interest, you will always have money. It's the same principle. Well, the problem with that conversion from the natural capital to the physical capital is that the trees do not breathe in carbon dioxide. Sorry, the houses do not breathe in carbon dioxide. And houses do not protect watersheds. And houses do not conserve biological diversity. So there is not complete substitutability for one capital converted into another form. And that's the key. So to get strong sustainability, what it tells us is that you do not have the same amount of capital when you convert one form to the other one. The only way you can be sure is if you plant back the trees. Then you have the physical capital, and you have your natural capital, and you have a win-win. Now that's easy. Most of the time you do not have a win-win. You have a trade-off. And that trade-off we always have to take into consideration. Even when you are building social capital, you might be reducing human capital, the collective versus the individual. And the trade-off is constantly at work. And it's the trade-off between these four columns that I use to start building my base of thinking about sustainability. And it's the use of these assets, when people transform these stocks into flows like income and other things, that they make their living. And what I will do, I know you're tired because you've been here for a while now, is I wanted to show you, to illustrate what the sustainable livelihoods approach looks like when you compare it to policy making for employment. I'll just show you some shifts so you start thinking about it. Remember we said we will go through and show you what are the tools, what are the goals of sustainable livelihood, what are the tools, what are the strategies, so then you can compare them to what we talked about this morning, the planning processes that you are involved in. Well, this is a summary because this is one of the closest things in sustainable livelihood. People normally think of livelihood in terms of jobs. They think of their livelihood in terms of their employment. And it's important, and that I find it's a very useful illustration to understand the difference between a livelihood and a job. The best way I can illustrate that is with a permanent secretary in Africa. A permanent secretary is, I don't know what is the equivalent in Egypt, is the most senior civil servant. After that is the minister. So the most senior civil servant in the public service is what? A director general? Deputy minister. Okay, like a deputy minister or a senior director general, whatever. Okay. This permanent secretary, in fact, the big boss in UNDP had asked me this when I presented this approach to our executive committee 2-3 years ago. He asked me whether the sustainable livelihoods approach had to do with the informal sector or the formal sector. He said he felt that the sustainable livelihoods approach was really about the informal sector, while jobs was for the formal sector. Well, I said, well, that's one way to think about it. But let us face the reality in the developing world. That's far from the truth in the developing world. Because of this, what we found with this permanent secretary, he was selling tomatoes in his office. He had parcels of tomatoes. You see tomatoes here? Yeah, tomatoes in his office. And he had children that he would buy candies and cigarettes and give them to go and sell in the street. So he'll get a profit from that. He will pay them a very small amount. And that is how, because his salary is so low for the public servant, he is not able to support his family from his job. So this was the case in which you had somebody with a very good job, but he did not have an adequate livelihood. And when I explained that, and then I said to the director of the bureau, I said to that director, you tell me now whether this person makes their livelihood from the formal sector or from the informal sector. It is easy to say that his job is in the formal sector, but his livelihood is not in the formal nor in the informal. And in today's world, there are so many people. In Egypt, you are rich, maybe. But in so much of today's world, people cannot make their living from one job. It's happening here as well? Oh, I think in rich Egypt, huh? Oh, gee. Moonlighting, yeah? And you get degrees on moonlighting.
Yes.
So you got your degree by moonlighting?
Yes. On
moonlighting. On moonlighting, not by moonlighting. There you go. So many people, and now even in North America and Europe, more and more people cannot look forward to a career job. In Canada, and I have done the work in Canada, we wrote a book called Designing Work for Sustainability in Canada. In Canada, 25% of the people are making their livelihood from a home base, not from going to work in a formal job. And more, that is happening even in the developed world. So that is, I wanted to distinguish between a livelihood and a job. Now, some jobs are enough for your livelihood. Then a job and a livelihood becomes the same. But in most cases, it is not. And when I talk to a Minister of Labor, and he says to me, or his permanent secretary, what policy shifts do you expect me to make to promote sustainable livelihoods rather than to try to create jobs? Because I was asked that question so many times, we made this list. So as soon as I'm asked the question, I pull out my slide and I put it on. First of all, and this is a matter of focus, it's not one or the other. That's very important. It's not one or the other. The focus on sustainable livelihoods is on the household or the community, while the focus on jobs and employment is on individuals and employees. And you will start to see the shift in the planning process that will occur. When you are talking about traditional employment, the heavy focus, labor market economics can only deal with the durable sector, where you apply the laws of supply and demand, where labor is seen as a commodity. And here, the major focus is on the informal sector, where people organize together to improve their lives. You know why this is important? I don't know the statistics for Egypt, but you probably know it. In India, who can make a guess? You must have heard of a country called India because it's a huge country. So big, 900 million people. I don't know how many millions you have in the whole of Egypt, but maybe 60? 65 million. So you must have heard of India. Of that huge country, what percentage of that country you think make their livelihood in the formal sector? What percentage of India makes their livelihood from the formal sector? Yeah, it's about 8%. 8. 92% make their livelihoods from the informal sector.
Informal only or both?
Informal. Informal. Now the individual might be, but when you subtract the contribution, the informal sector contributes 92% to the livelihoods of the overall population. And in Africa, because Africa is not a country, so the statistics vary from different countries. In Africa, it varies between 80 to 95% making their livelihoods from the informal sector. Yet we have been tackling policy making using traditional labor market economics, which was developed to deal with the formal sector, not the informal sector. And so we can go through. All of these will show you what are the planning shifts, what are the policy shifts you make when you think of livelihoods and sustainable livelihoods compared to jobs or traditional employment. And just an example of a shift. Let me close by just saying, and maybe I will go through a few more slides with you when we have done the break, when your brain is a little bit more absorptive, so that your stomach is okay and then your brain. But I just wanted to make one or two other points about goals. If we can put on the light. What are the goals of a sustainable livelihood program, broadly speaking? And I'll take 45 seconds. The goals typically are, we have used sustainable livelihoods programs typically for designing programs for poverty eradication, or if you wish, poverty reduction. I prefer that word. It's a very difficult thing, eradication, alleviation, reduction. I typically say poverty reduction in a sustainable way. And that's typically the goal of the overall program. Okay? So we will compare what your goals are in your planning process. And not once did I hear so far that one of your goals was poverty reduction since this morning. So it will be interesting to compare the goal of a sustainable livelihoods program with what you've been doing, but that's not the only goal. I mean, that's the main one. The other thing I would say that we are looking for in here are the strategies, and remember that the strategies that are involved in the livelihood, you can talk of local livelihoods, and John has just spoken a lot about local livelihoods. In the developing world, the major difference that occurred to me as you were speaking, John, was that in the developed world, like like North America, like Canada or the US, the macroeconomics can be taken for granted. The macroeconomic is so big and strong that it doesn't change as much as it happens in a developing country. Because overnight, our currency is devalued. Overnight, we have major job losses, and the economy is in serious trouble from shocks in the external system. So livelihood can be sustainable at the local level in a developed country. It can never be sustainable only by considering local variables in a developing country. And that is why in a developing country like Egypt, the macro-micro linkage is crucial. Because a shock at the macro level will destroy all the good work that you do at the community level. That is crucial. And that is why the second thing, while we do the assets approach just like John has described, but we use this broader chart I have just shown you, and I will get them to copy that chart if you want, the broader assets chart. The next step is the macro-micro link, the policy link. Then we look at the governance structure. Because if local governments cannot interact well with people, you will never get sustainable livelihood. The center, the national government, will never be able to reach the local community. And local government capacity is very important. So governance is very important, and then we go through the other steps which you'll see. Policy, governance, investment, technology, monitoring and evaluation. Those are the tools, the strategies, and if they're not really tools, those are the strategic steps. But each of those steps has tools. Now I have here in this so-called draft primer, draft papers on each of those strategic steps. The policy step, what is the difference between traditional policy and making policy in this context? The governance step, the technology step, the investment step, they're all here. Now we can't read all of this, and I don't want to even start thinking you can read all of this during the week. What I would suggest is the concept paper I gave you this morning, and it outlines very briefly all of these steps. Each one of you has the concept paper for SL. Okay? And if you don't have it, we have a few more. But one paper here, apart from the concept paper, or there are two papers here that you should get. One will be, and I will ask Amani to organize the copy, one will be the investment strategy. I think that one is key in Egypt. And you will see how we make the link between macro investment strategy and microfinance. We are convinced that microfinance will not have a major impact on poverty unless it is linked to the macrofinance strategy of the country. It will merely keep people above poverty, out of poverty, but at subsistence level. So I will recommend, and I will copy for you, the investment strategy paper and the tools. Well, John has gone through several of them, and his slides we are copying for you.
Yes.
So you will have those. You have them already?
Yes.
Very good. So then you will start getting the concrete tools we were talking about this morning, which were not yet in the manual. But of course, as you know, we will be revising the manual. We will not put all the tools there, but with the manual will at least cross-refer to where you will find the detailed tools.
The tools are in the manual but are not detailed.
Okay.
The steps for how to do and to do the...
Right, I know that. So the details, the manual will point you, will cross-refer if it doesn't do now, where are the sources of the detailed tools? And then we'll give you those two, right? So that's all I wanted to tell you now. I will go more now that my slides are here step by step at later points in the week. Now all we need to do is, I think that Dr. Tariq wants to give you these papers from this morning, from your own work, so you can check and make any changes of any things that might have been missing that you want to put in. Because the consultants will take your output to formalize them. No?
صورة تثبيت الهيئة ده صورة تثبيت الهيئة اللي هو اتعمل الصبح نوزع على كل واحد نعرض السايت يعني كل واحد يراجعه وإذا كان يتناسب حاجة يكتبها ويكتب اسمه يديها لي بس أو يعني لو في حاجة مكتوبة غلط يعني غلط يعني بلاش ده مش مشاكل
So this is not one answer, the whole set of points in each. So just first fill out the GOPP column and then come to the SLE column. And if it's not working, we'll have to give you more guidance.
انتوا ممكن تستخدموا الكونسبت بيبر بتاعت SLA عشان تشوفوا الاوبجكتيف بتاعتها ايه وبتقول. تعملوا الكونسبت بيبر بس تعملوا الكونسبت بيبر يا العربي يا الانجليزي.
They have the manual, they have the concept paper. They might have to continue tomorrow because they have to
الأنشطة ايه الأهداف كل خطوة فيها الأهداف. ثلاث أيام
Where is but each one consultant is working in each one.
We should have the oh, we might, yeah. This is really a major part of it. Look what I have. Let me see if I can. I'll tell you what I have, for example, for your objective. I have capture all the objectives for GOPP planning that I have from your structure. Some areas development, the preservation of heritage, resettlement, sector objectives like agriculture, urban development, following the state 5-year objectives, like master plan, all these things and all of these objectives are put this morning is put then we will compare on the website what is the objective of the SL, which is largely public adoption.
حاجة
Okay. John, you want to come up with a little list of how to compare these things?
Yeah, I could.
The real guide to you from the SL side is the one that compares employment.
It's really interesting. In our world, we would tend to put almost all of these categories in the institutional sector, the triangle sector, right? And almost all of these are in the service sector.
Exactly. So they're direct parallels.
Institutional work. Trade-off between informal and formal structures, the movement of both the understanding of labor and other resources from the informal to the formal sector. Is there reliable stuff being done on the trade-offs, cost and benefits?
I'm not the best person to answer that. I don't know these consultants may have I am not aware of the technique. It's not to say where how I find that out. Because from my own education, I have studied the government structure, and I have studied the book that you should read. I might not mention it to you before, but yes, I think it is Avenues of Participation.
Yes, I haven't seen it, but yeah.
By Singerman. This is a lady who did her PhD here, and she described how the network within Cairo, the informal network, etc. So those are the things that give me a sense of what has been done for certain universities. In terms of whether they're translated into planning, it's not just when they discover now.
وطريقة ازاي انا اتشيف الاوبجكتيف. انا كان في طبعا ميثود معينة طبعا تختلف تماما عن التجارب. عشان كده انا لما قلت في الاول كان مهم جدا ان احنا نعرف الاول نعرف بعدين احنا نعرف نقول لكم ازاي نصنف مستوى معين المستقبلين ونبتدي نخش في الانت كده احنا هنغرق على المدينة وهناك على حي
Okay, I'm coming. You still have access to copying Amani? Yeah, I know, but you have access to the machine. Yeah. Somebody else has access? I have done some comparison. Yeah.
انا هقول لك اولا انا عندي مثلا بيعمل مدينه تطور عدد سكان معين يعني
we start talking about
No, I can put the same objective for
Then what if I have, why don't you just take one level, this stage, just compare that one level that is relevant with the SL2 level.
that's why when it comes to
Well, because
the
you know,
beginning of this one, that we should not to present us what an end and we can present all our questions and even the contract. Because when I know what this is, it will be easy to me and to know which type of mandate can be applied.
clearly it has not been well done because that is what we thought we did on Saturday morning. Remember we had a session about this, but it clearly didn't come out clearly enough. So what we should do for this afternoon, if you think that SLA is more at the local level or the micro level, up to now, just do that compartment. And then tomorrow, right, so don't do all of it, take that part of it that allows you your comparison for now. Leave the other part out. Clear. And then tomorrow when we go through, what I will do, I will begin tomorrow by a full presentation of what is SLA. Then it will give you
Now we know what
no, then I will do the policy step to mean governance step. I will do yes, let me do that tomorrow morning. For now, the part that I'm sure people from community level. So whatever your planning process is at the community level, that you have also from the SL side, and you have it from your side. That you can do. So let's just do that, and then we'll talk about the other one. But you're mixing up method, yeah, but you're mixing up the methodology with the objective.
What kind of land desert or land reclamation? Something very close. Yeah. If I'm doing arrangement plan, any kind of if I'm doing arrangement plan, what's my typical No, I'm not going. No, I'm not going. If I'm doing arrangement, I'm not going to look at building by building. No, because arrangement plan deals with either in the one rate, Greater Cairo, or like region number 3, I'm working in this is on rate.
Right.
I can't.
What will you be doing with that? What will be the objective of the regional plan?
The objective of the regional plan is to
For what? Why would you have a report?
and for instance, region number 3 to absorb 3 million of people.
Correct.
Taking out 3 million of
What?
Cairo.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Now,
See, the objective is completely different.
right.
The resources is completely
So what you should do is separately compare regional plans with and all the different levels of punishment. That will make it easier to do the comparison. Because when you do the regional plan, the objective is the resources that we look at and so on, and then compare it with the right. That will be helpful. So take a regional plan, how it compares, a local plan, how it compares.
What was the point of
I put it yeah, why don't you just take one example? Take a regional plan, let's compare it with the local one, or a local plan. Just do one for now, let's see how it goes. Don't do all. Everybody works at all levels, or some people work only at regional? At all levels. So just take one level first and do comparison. And then we look at the other. And we will one level. Now, all these papers I'm sharing with you are only ideas to think about, huh? Ultimately, what you produce, you draw from them, but they are not any blueprints, as I said. I have done all these things as I talk about them, and some of them will be quite complicated. What I've now shared with you is the theoretical things. I confuse everybody when I talk about the theoretical part. So I don't bother to talk about them. So I love complexity theory. And I don't bother to talk about it. Chaos theory. That's the only theory that exists. What they are finding is that you should take just one level. Just take that level. Don't take all the levels. That's what they were telling me. If you take a regional plan, resources, you look at the goals and objectives are all different. And if you take a local plan, if you take the different levels individually, I think that was the guy. So in that case, this comes from right, so I've changed it. I'll take this out of here. No, if we can't finish it today, then we'll continue tomorrow. Yeah. So don't take nothing. No, because what they're telling me is they want to do this exercise for each level separately. It will be more orderly and be easier to do. This one. No, you see, the problem is that I thought when the work was Saturday, we had a session called What is SLA? What I'm understanding now is that section is not clearly explained, but all accepted. Because I have left lots of questions to Anna. In Arabic translation, I'm not understanding it perfectly. So what I will do is, I will go through tomorrow a full presentation again of the SLA. John has done the step one in a way for us, which is the community level assessment of assets. But the policy level, the governance issue, the investment issue, I haven't done that in a formal way. So if we start this way, by the time I'm not, it will be much easier.
Sounds right to me, Naresh.
Yeah.
Sounds right to me.
Yeah. So you find out, you know, you go.
Gotta revisit occasionally.
So if this makes sense, then it is that way. Then all we are really qualified to do now is community level. Because that's what we have done on the SLA side. Yeah, that's what I was doing, but they just say no, we are not ready. All the levels together. You want to each level separately. So if you find, it will be interesting to compare it to
Yeah, I read the book already, but they refuse to do that. Yeah.
if they want to continue. That's fine. Then we'll compare the two groups in the hall. Yeah. You don't have enough of this. These are ideas. So I don't want them to do To really know if you understand it, then I will I will look at it outside. Or maybe you are not. No? Through governance to the macro policy level. So we will go through that today. And having done that, I have also asked both John and Dr. Tariq, and you've been involved in this as well, I think, Hannah, in helping to prepare these checklists, like this, to expand on this and to get more detailed elements, the appropriate elements for comparison between SLA and GOP. And they have both been working on that all night last night. So that by today we would have, and Dr. Tariq would have been here at 5 to 9. The reason he's not in the room, I hope, is that he's over there getting the materials typed up. And so that we will have that in a short while, and having all of that material to discuss. So by lunchtime today, it will be clear where are the points of linkages and need for capacity building between the GOPP, or the planning process in Egypt, and the SLA. So slowly, I think it's taking shape and focus. So let us begin then with which group. This group was more advanced yesterday.
We agreed yesterday that you will start your this session this morning by presenting what is SLA.
Yeah, but to help me.
The difference we have faced.
Yeah, but we agreed with, I will present that, and I will present that, yeah. But we didn't agree that we will do it first. So I wanted you to say what was your experience of your group as you tried a comparison yesterday. First. If that's okay. If not, I can present first as well. But what did you do for 1 hour yesterday? That's all we wanted. From 3 to 4. No, but the whole group doesn't know. What were your struggles? Yeah. So I just want the entire group to know. Like when you discuss the difficulty of the different levels. So if somebody here can tell us in 3 minutes or 5 minutes what you tried to do and what were your concerns, so that we can address those, and the other group will tell us what they tried to do and what they achieved. Right? Let us talk loudly so everyone can hear. We'll just say it in the mic so everyone can hear. We don't want the side talk has to be public talk. One family.
The problem that we saw yesterday that the detailed objectives of GO are the same as SLA. But the problem we didn't write about the list.
Yeah, you don't have to write it up. You can talk on it from your head. Anything else the group wants to add, or? Just a brief statement on what you did yesterday.
That's what I mean, the presentation of what we have presented already, what GOPPs are.
Right. What you need.
Planning, structures, strategies, tools, activities, all of it.
What I
want from you now to do is to present in the same way what is SLA. So after that, I can do the comparison.
But yesterday, when you tried to do the comparison, you tried for 1 hour and you had some difficulties, right?
Yes, one difficulty was I don't know
just say that into the mic. Just say that into the mic. What were the difficulties?
I don't know what is SLA.
But you had some other difficulties yesterday. So you don't want to tell anybody, huh? So let me tell them then. Those difficulties were that at the regional level, give me the mic. She doesn't want to say she had any difficulties. Difficulties are great, nothing is wrong with difficulties. The challenges, okay. What I heard was that at the regional level, you have a certain level of generality that the resources you deal with would not be specific like the household resources, because you're dealing now at a much broader level. For example, if you were planning in the South Valley, you would not be directly responsible for the individual cities within the South Valley, right? Like Barafra or Asut and so on. You will be operating at a different level. So the difficulty is, when you are planning at, say, the regional level, how would you compare that with the SLA, which seemed yesterday to be at the community level? So we would have had that kind of thing. That's what I was hearing. So that is what I wanted to share with the group. You want to add? Here he is. I told you he was getting these copies with. Yes, please.
When we go through the index, for example, of LA, we find from the very beginning.
Which index? With compare with employment?
The manual.
The manual, yes.
This one.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Number one is some preparatory steps. First one is to make some meetings. Then to try to find suitable entries for the society. To form working groups. All this in the same this step. These are done in GOPP at all levels. For example, when we are beginning a regional planning, we make some meetings, but with a certain rank of people who is involved in this level of planning. When we are going to make a detailed plan, we also begin with meetings, but with other people who are involved in this district or in this neighborhood. So all the steps I find that are in the sequence are the same, that in GOPP at all levels. The difference is to whom we meet, with whom, where, when, the level only. But the steps as consequence, it is done.
Right. That is not unusual, because in any planning process, generically the steps would appear to be the same, but with whom, the details with whom, and also how might be different. And that will become clearer.
With whom and how, it is according to the level of labor.
No, but also we will see that there is a qualitative difference perhaps when we go through, like you're asking, the more details of the SLA, which I will do shortly.
Well, maybe I'll say now just from the index.
Right.
The consequence of these steps are the same.
Yes, and that's not unusual, so that's fine. Okay, so we want to get the other group then to, you have a question?
I do have a question.
But if it has to do with the details of the SLA, it will be better if we do that after the presentation. The answer might come out then, but if you want to go ahead, ask it.
Try it and then please let me know.
Okay. Go ahead. You will say it in English, right? Arabic. Okay.
انا بسأل كمان اللي يهمني ان انا اعرفه ايه اللي بيحصل جوه الاجتماع. يعني
يا جماعه كده هنغرق ومش هنطلع بحاجه، عشان انت تعرف اللي بيحصل في الاجتماع بتاع GOPP، هل هو ده الهدف من الندوه؟
لا
انا الهدف ان انا اجي اعرف الايه اللي ايه؟
لا بس هو عشان يعرف ايه اللي بيحصل جوه الاجتماعات. What he's saying is that it's very important also for you, in order to be able to give a feedback, is to know what happens inside the meetings of the GOPP. So the importance of this is that you can relate the SLA to what goes on in the meetings, because maybe then there
has been done before the training course. I suppose this would have been done before the training course. So the trainers are ready to say what is important to us. We are still testing if it is suitable for us or not.
Right, that was difficult to do. Can I answer that first and then? That is exactly what we tried to do. And that is why we had the 3 consultants try to prepare papers on the conventional planning, and we had people who are familiar with GOPP work to bring out that. But what we got was a very general, as you were here on Saturday, a very general statement on overall planning. It did not go as far as identifying in enough detail the individual steps for us to make that connection. But that is exactly why we commissioned these consulting papers, to look at what GOPP does now, so we can understand that thoroughly. The other drawback we had was that these papers came to me in Arabic. And by the time, well, first of all, we could not open them because our computers in New York apparently doesn't know how to open documents in Arabic. So when we failed to do that, we got from our office here by courier the papers. But by the time they arrived, I was almost leaving New York. So we had no time to translate into English. The result was that I could not have read that, and the first time I was hearing the details was on Saturday, and what I heard was very general. I mean, having heard the presentation, I did not find out more about GOPP than I knew before, because virtually any planning process would have told me that. So that is why we are still going through here these details. So that's the background of that issue. But let's hear it out.
أنا بالذات سألت السؤال عن إيه اللي بيحصل جوه الاجتماعات عشان أفتكر الفرق اللي ممكن إحنا نلاقيه ما بين تطبيق ال SLA أو تطبيق أي سكيل ثاني. هو هنلاقيه طبيعة المناقشة اللي بتحصل. أنا ما يهمنيش تفاصيل اللي بيحصل.
عايزين نتفاضل حضرتك بتقول كده، هل أنت فاهم إيه هو ال SLA وإيه اللي بيدور جوه المناقشات؟
إلى حد ما ممكن أكون.
طب إحنا ما نعرفش، اللي إحنا
أنا عشان كده بسأل إيه اللي بيحصل. أنا ما افترضتش إن هو بيحصل حاجة غلط أو عكس.
مطلبنا الآتي إن إحنا to go in detail what is SLA and what is the process of SLA, and we know exactly what we are doing, so the comparison will be much easier. That's what I'm saying.
Oh no, that is clear. No, that's clear. But let me answer this question, Naresh. And the answer to that is yesterday in the small groups, they were discussing exactly that, and we have now the sheets as to exactly what is going on within GOPP. That's what we spent yesterday morning doing. So what the groups will do, they know now exactly what is going on, and the way you will find that out is in working in the small groups. But what we will do is we have a lot of detail on what GOPP does. But the group is saying we do not have the same level of detail about SLA. Now, the plan of the meeting was that we would have had this level of detail through our presentation on Saturday morning. But now it is clear to us that that level of detail did not come out. So we will do that, and that's what I will do very shortly. But I wanted us to begin with this discussion so we understand clearly the context. But did this other group wanted to present something?
Something, not all.
No. Don't worry about perfection yet.
This presentation is showing what we so far understood till now about the SLA. First, we put some items for comparison. We put here sources, or what we say assets. GOPP is based on paper resources and natural resources, and other resources or other assets is supported assets to reach urban development. In SLA, as you understood till now, it's based on human and social and natural assets. Objectives of GOPP mainly is focusing on urban management and environmental development using housing, services, infrastructure studies, and so on. In SLA, as Mr. Naresh said, it's reducing. It's not all objectives. We just focusing on mainly. And SLA is reducing poverty level in sustainable way. As Mr. Naresh said, SLA is reducing poverty level in sustainable way. Tools in GOPP could be studying present situation for planning or something like that, showing problems, tensions, and constraints. Problems and constraints and tensions, and then starting to do what we call strategy or physical planning or something like that. In SLA, it's only determining the available assets in the society. It means potentials, focusing on potentials or focusing on assets.
its potential. And the level in GPP is working in all levels, national level, regional, and community level, if we are talking about detailed planning. In SLA, as you understood, it's focusing on household level or community level. Adaptive strategies. And GPP, we are making some adaptive strategies if we are talking about disasters like flood, earthquakes, something like that. We are trying to make our planning away from danger places. If we are talking about cracks in the earth or floods coming from here and there, we are making some corrections in nature just to prevent people away from this. In SLA, it's adaptive situation with household or family problems. Yes, it's living conditions, but we are talking about environmental air conditions here in Egypt. That we so far listed here, and we have some more which is not here yet. But it's not all, but this is our thoughts for understanding points.
No questions? Yeah.
Thank you to what Ahmed has written, because here he has shown clearly what I was trying to say, that SLA, we can say, is a part or a point from what we do as a comprehensive. So if you see, for example, assets, we have many assets. One of them is connected to SLA. We have many objectives. One of them is one of SLA. So we have the comprehensive, and SLA is a point or a part from what we do. At all levels and in everything. Asset, objective, tool, level, in everything.
Okay. Very good. But SLA, as we have understood it so far, that was his point at the beginning. Right. So the point being made is that let us now go through the full SLA presentation. Then we will all be better placed to do a more comprehensive analysis. Yeah? Who knows? Let's try, huh? So, let's go. Good. Right. Oh. All right. So, if we are ready, then it's 9:30. So let's go into this presentation now of SLA. The long-awaited moment has arrived, where we will do this strange thing called this presentation. So I think the best way to do this would be for me to go through the presentation. I'm happy, I don't have a problem stopping and answering questions as I go along. That's fine. But that might delay the presentation, and sometimes the answers might be coming later in the presentation to the questions you're asking. So maybe the most efficient way of doing it is if I did the presentation, and please note the questions, and then we come back and have the discussion, so it becomes as clear as we possibly can make it. Okay. The first thing, of course, is what do we use this SLA for? I want to point out at the very beginning that sustainable livelihoods is applicable to all people. People who live in poverty as well as in non-poor. The concept of sustainable livelihoods is not only about poor people. In fact, if the non-poor don't live in a sustainable way, it will be impossible for the poor to ever achieve sustainable livelihoods. So that's the first point. However, what I will present to you is an approach that seeks to focus on poverty, because most of our work has been on how to make the livelihoods of those who live in poverty improved and more sustainable. So both to help people to get themselves out of poverty, and also to prevent them from falling back into poverty. So that's the overall statement. So what I am presenting to you, therefore, is not SL as an overall global thing, but merely sustainable livelihoods approach as a strategy for poverty reduction in a sustainable way. That aspect is what I'm presenting. Right? So I just wanted to clear up that first point. Why did we work on developing this? And just a quick note on the history of its development. The concept of sustainable livelihoods was first introduced in the international literature in around 1983. And it came into the literature when we had the World Commission on Environment and Development holding worldwide consultations. They had various panels. One of these panels was a panel on food security. When the panel was studying what were the problems of food security over 40 years of development effort, they found that food security was not only a problem of small farmer productivity. For 40 years we had believed that food security was a problem of smallholder agricultural productivity. What they discovered, which will be self-evident to all of us, it will be nothing new to this group, but what they discovered was that food security was a problem of poverty in all its dimensions. The ability to produce on the farm, but also the ability to earn income, the ability to find the food, the distribution problem of food, and so on. All those were related to food security. They therefore wanted to find a concept that would explain food security, which was much broader than agriculture, and introduce the concept of sustainable livelihood. So it was first used in 1983 by the panel, which was chaired by Swaminathan, and the book called Towards Food 2000 was written following that. After that was introduced in 83, it was then again, it came out in the report called Our Common Future, which the World Commission on Environment and Development published in 1987. Our Common Future, published by Oxford University Press. The General Assembly of the United Nations debated that report, and they endorsed the report. And in 1989, I hear myself saying this before, I must have said this here before, but anyway, in 1989, the General Assembly passed a resolution and said that the links between environment, development, and poverty were so important that we would convene a meeting of the heads of states and governments from all over the world to come and agree on an action plan which will address this problem all over the world. But when they started the debate, many governments felt that what we should do is separate these two things. We had three things on the table: poverty, environment, and development. Three things. And they said, let us take two at a time. Let us take environment and development, and then we will take poverty later on. So in 1992, in Rio, they focused on environment and development generally. And in 1995, in Copenhagen, they then focused on poverty and employment and all the other aspects of social development, what they call social exclusion. So we have two major conferences that have influenced the work on sustainable livelihood, where all governments agreed. Those two were Rio in 1992 and Copenhagen in 1995. And your government, like so many other governments, have agreed to those commitments. It is based upon those observations that a lot of research work started. What does it mean? How do we do it? Because when politicians meet, they make an agreement, and they don't bother with the implementation. It's the technical people like ourselves who then have to figure out how to do this, what kinds of tools we need, what kinds of programs we will design, and so on. So the work started in many fora, in two main places. The two key institutions that did the research work to formulate the tools and the methodology were one, IDS in Sussex, that is the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex in the UK, and the other one was at the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Winnipeg in Canada. The work at IDS continues, and in fact at the end of this month they are presenting several case studies as well as to what they have learned. As you know, 5 years or 7 years in development is a very short time. And that is why we are still in the process of learning more and more. I was leading the program at the Institute in Canada, and we developed a partnership with UNDP and worked in 5 countries in sub-Saharan Africa to test some of the concepts and the tools in the field. And those countries were Ethiopia, Kenya, Zimbabwe, South Africa, and Burkina Faso. Those were the 5 countries, and we have 10 volumes of the case studies we carried out, testing how to link local adaptive strategies with policy. That was the key contribution that our institute made. While IDS was doing a lot of the field work to understand the local level activity, we were more interested in the policy linkages. Now, work has advanced in several fronts. IDS work has advanced, IISD work has advanced, and I joined UNDP in 1996 to develop the work within the UN system. So that's the history. So let's get down now to the, that's where it's coming from. What is it and why is it that we are talking about these things? The first aspect of the what problem are we trying to address, what objective and why? And the first issue is that most poverty reduction problems, and remember I said yesterday and I will say again, and like I said this morning, that what I'm presenting to you is the SLA as a strategy for poverty reduction in a sustainable way. I keep repeating that. That has to be clear to us. So why did we do all of this work? First of all, because most poverty reduction programs in the world largely are geared towards economic growth and trickle down. That's what we have had for many years. In other words, we said, if we get economic growth right, if we could get 6% or 7%, I don't know what the figure is in Egypt, 6, 7, 8 is the usual kind of figure, then poverty will be reduced on its own. And we have done that for 40 years or so. But we have found it does not work. Poverty is not reduced by trickle down. They do have a small effect, but a very small effect. Because the world realized that, the NGOs and everybody else said, especially the NGO community, that governments cannot reach the poor. They don't know how to do that. We are much better placed, we are smaller, we are more flexible, we are able to work at the community level, and the whole thing of participatory development became big story. Okay, so this is what we got. Participatory development. But most of the NGO participatory development work at the community level, at the local level, did not make any linkages to the policy level. They would work and do very good work at the community level, in the villages and in the cities. That was where their strength was. But most NGOs do not have the strength to make a link at the policy level. In fact, they don't have the comparative advantage because many of them are not trusted by governments. And governments would listen or not listen at all to them. When they listen, they would just listen in a very a way in which it just passes through from one ear to the other one. So we ended up with local level activities, so-called community development activities, which were isolated and weak links to the macro policy level. And the third aspect of all of this was the question of sustainability as discussed at Rio. And we had learned by then that sustainable development was not only about environment. Environmental sustainability was very important. But there were at least 3 angles to sustainability. You had to have environmental sustainability, but you also had to have social sustainability or social equity, because if you created inequality in the society, what would happen was you will get social decay, you will get social tension, and you will get society breaking down, drugs and so on, and all kinds of other social ills. And so you will not be sustainable. And thirdly, you also have to have economic sustainability. That is to say, unless your processes were economically efficient, you would lose out in the market. You will not be able to compete in the marketplace. And you therefore also have to be economically sustainable. So 3 angles: environmental sustainability, social, and economic. Okay? And what people used to say was, let's just get the economics right, and then we will integrate the environment after that. And that didn't work very well. So we needed a way of integrating sustainability up front. So those first 3 points lead to that problem statement that we were struggling to bring those 3 together. That was the struggle. And that's what this approach tries to do. Okay. Definition. We said yesterday, and I will repeat the definition, and I want you to pay close attention to the fact that livelihoods are activities assets and entitlements. Quickly, activities are things like jobs, things that people do every day in their life to make their living. And that's easy. And you have a long table of comparison of the employment versus sustainable livelihoods comparison, which I gave you yesterday. But that really deals with the activities only. The assets I will talk about in a minute, but I do also have a table, in fact, on what are assets. Right? I gave you that yesterday. The 4 types: human capital, social capital, natural capital, and physical capital. Those are the assets which people use to make their living. The third aspect is the entitlement. What do we mean by entitlement? Entitlements come from the work of a now only recently acclaimed economist who we have been using for many years to advise UNDP work, but who has been discredited for many years until suddenly he got a Nobel Prize last year. That guy's name is Amartya Sen, and he's introduced really the concept of entitlement into economics and done most of the work, although now it's much broader. And he introduced it after studying the Bengal famine in India. And what he found was that poor people at the same level of low income, some were starving during the famine, but others were not. And he tried to investigate what was the difference between those who were starving and those who were not, although the income level was the same. And he found that those who were not starving had other things that he called entitlement, such as they might have family members who had certain positions and who owned certain kinds of property or had jobs. And they could say to the shopkeeper, look, I will ask my cousin to pay you next month if you would give me some food now. In other words, he called that an exchange entitlement. And then you had other things. You might have, when your father died or your mother died, you would inherit 20 years from now some property. And you will be able to pay later, 10 years or 15 years or something, at some kind of an interest. But it was an exchange entitlement. So also that's one kind, and that's the exchange entitlement or the economic form of entitlement. But there are other forms as well. Take many poor people who cannot afford to bury their dead. Many of them form church groups or burial societies. So the burial society as a whole will have some resources that they collect. And when one member has a problem, they together will cover that cost. So you expect that that will happen because you're a member. So you have an entitlement within that informal group you have formed. And that's another kind of entitlement. The final type is the entitlement that people get from the state, or formal entitlement. That is to say things like pension. When you get old in many welfare states, you know that when you're old you will get some kind of old age pension. It may be adequate or inadequate. But at least you're expecting something. You know you have a right to it. But you also know that if you lose your job in some societies, you get what is called unemployment insurance or social insurance. That's another kind of entitlement. And the final type that also comes from the state is your rights as a citizen. And that leads to what we call the rights-based approach. The whole list of human rights, things that you're entitled to. Freedom, liberty, the freedom to form groups, and all kinds of other things. So what we found then was that the old analysis of livelihoods was that livelihoods was activities, and that when you did a plan, what you were planning for were people, how people will act, how they will move, where they will work. But you have, and I know you do this now, you also have to plan of how people will have access to assets in order to make their livelihood. And you also have to take into your plan the fact of the entitlement, because that's the reality of people's lives. And how would we do that? Now, if you are already taking all of that effectively into the plan, that's fine. You don't have to revisit that. But let's open the discussion at least and make a conclusion that yes, all of these, the activities, the assets, and the entitlements are taken into account in the planning process. Not necessarily only by GOPP, but by local authorities or whoever else, national government. Okay. So that's the livelihood concept. Now the sustainability, we said three things about sustainability. We already said that sustainability was these three in sustainable development. But the one that we want to introduce here for the livelihood is that a livelihood is sustainable when that livelihood system, the household or the community, can cope and recover from shocks and stresses. That's the key operational concept. What do we mean by shocks and stresses? If you had somebody who was the major income earner in a household, that might be either the man or the woman. If that person dies or leaves the household, suddenly that income is no longer available in that household. That's a major shock to the livelihood of the household. How does the household cope with that shock and recover from it? Let me give you one actual example that we have observed. There are hundreds. I'll just give you one. We have observed households that had access to agricultural land but never used the land because the income from the job was enough to support the household. But then the income earner died, and they coped with that shock by starting to cultivate the land. They turned to that asset to cultivate the land. Another household in the same village had no access to agricultural land. They took their children out of school and sent them to work. Now these were two different coping strategies. We would argue that the one in which they had access to agricultural land was much more sustainable than the one in which you had to take the children out of school and send them to work. In other words, then, the entry point for doing sustainable livelihood is to understand how households and communities cope and adapt to shocks and stresses. Well, some people say that in some households there is no shock and stress. We have not so far, in our 7 years of work in about 25 countries, found any household or community in the developing world that does not suffer from shocks and stresses. Everywhere we have found that there are severe shocks and stresses, and that the presence of adaptive strategies among the poor are always there. And therefore we have to figure out a way, a participatory way, of how to understand adaptive strategies. So our entry point, and here we need to compare your entry point for planning, our entry point for SLA to work towards poverty is adaptive strategies, how people cope with shock and stress. And I want you to constantly think of entry points, objectives, goals as I go through this. In your mind, at least make a little note, because you will be comparing the planning process and the implications of these right through. I hope we are able to do that and follow that, so you're making a checklist. And our experts on the planning process will also be doing that and comparing it with the checklist we already did last time. Okay, so that's the concept. I promised to come back to the asset. But yesterday I did this already and everybody was there when I talked about the importance of sustainability in transforming one asset to another one. This is merely a checklist. So when you're doing your planning process and you are thinking about planning, remember now that if we are planning for SLA, what we are really doing is planning for poverty reduction in a sustainable way. Yesterday we found out from what you did that you make your plans for very many different kinds of objectives. But many of those objectives can be indirectly related to poverty reduction anyway, and we can check those relationships. But when you are planning, you want to make sure that the poor will continue to have access to assets, and indeed increase access to assets. If your planning process does not increase the access to assets by the poor, then you will not be planning to achieve SLA objectives. That's very important, and we need to ask that question. How do we figure out a priori, at the beginning of the planning process, whether the plans we make will ultimately help the poor to have increased access to assets, or will it reduce their access to assets? We need to ask that question. And all of these kinds of assets. Now, no plan is perfect, so we're not talking about any perfect plan, but we're talking generally speaking about whether we will increase access or not. Also, we need not only to talk about access, that's one aspect, we also need to talk about ownership. Access to assets is one aspect. Ownership is a different thing. And we have also found out, and I think you know generally, that when people own assets like land or whatever else, they are better able to utilize that asset rather than when they have access but not ownership. In many cases, access is enough, but typically ownership assists people in utilizing that thing to get a loan from the bank or to do something else if they have ownership of that asset. And I talked about, remember I talked yesterday about the transformation between natural capital and human-made capital in terms of sustainability. And we can do the same between human and social, and we can also talk of the relationship between social and natural, because the way communities manage their resources is very different from the way individuals manage their resources. And then we can talk about how the state and communities together in what is called co-management manage resources for sustainability. But I won't get into all of that. Just to make sure that in the planning process, you have a broad checklist. What is going to happen to the poor as you make your plan in terms of their access to assets? Is the plan explicitly assisting them to gain access? Is it just neutral? Or is it in fact going to reduce their access to assets? Of all these types. Okay. Now I told you what sustainable livelihoods was, I better tell you what it is not. And I tell you this because of our work in about 20 odd countries. These are the kinds of questions that our colleagues will ask. Some of them will say, what you are talking about is what we always did. Same thing, we always did it. Nothing new. But we call it integrated rural development, and you call it sustainable livelihoods. Well, we have to take care to point out what the differences are. And it's not always easy at the beginning to see the difference. The difference, you will hear the word integrated rural development. What integrated rural development was an attempt to bring independent projects designed largely by donors and governments together in an integrated framework. They were largely designed in a top-down way by governments or donors, and then we try to integrate them so we can get an integrated framework. And they also, to their credit, the people who did integrated rural development consulted with local people. They did consult with local communities. But it was not participation, the way we are defining it. In other words, the donors and the governments were trying to get people to participate in their projects that they had brought together. It was not participation in the sense of where donors and governments were jointly working with people so that they can achieve their vision. That was the key difference. So it was, when we explained that, then people start to understand what is the difference then between sustainable livelihoods approach and integrated rural development. And that takes a long time for people who are experts in integrated rural development to start internalizing the difference. The World Bank, UNDP, and others have now concluded that the integrated rural development approach does not work. especially the World Bank, and they have published volumes now in their analysis of why this fails. The second thing is that it is not community development. But again, it is very commonly confused with community development and community building. Now, I put it dramatically like that for effect. I say it is not community development because it is not only limited to community development, but draws heavily from good community development practice and goes further than that. That's the important point, because it goes on to link to the macro policy level, and we will talk about that in a minute. Okay. Community development being largely at the local level. The other thing that it is commonly confused with is PRA. And we have a classic example up here in which our manual seems to be a PRA manual. But participatory rural development, or participatory development for that matter, has largely been at the local level and has been a needs-based approach. Largely getting people together to articulate their needs better. It has made a very important contribution, and we use the PRA tool, but we use the PRA tool to focus on assets and visioning rather than on needs, and the development of action plans to address those needs. The other thing that it is confused with, commonly, is community-based natural resources management. Now, as planners, I know you might not be using these, but development practitioners and NGOs are engaged worldwide in doing all of these different kinds of development work. Community-based natural resources management has as its policy objective resource management. SLA has as its policy objective improving the livelihoods of the poor in a sustainable way. Where the resource is not the policy objective, the resource is a policy instrument to achieve a policy objective. So it's a difference of means and ends. The objective now is improving people's livelihoods. Resources become merely one aspect to get there, and that leads to the difference in practice. The other thing it is not is income generating activities, and that one might be one that you can relate much closer to, because that's common in urban areas. Livelihoods are closely related to activities. We said that earlier, but it is much more. And many of our own programs within UNDP, income generating activities are what they have when they have sustainable livelihood heading. So when we read our own country office programs, we see the nice heading because they know that we are looking to see whether they are doing work on sustainable livelihood, which is a top priority of UNDP. When we read the paragraph below it, what they're describing is income generating activities. Now worldwide, if you travel, and many of you have, I'm sure, and you observe income generating activities, typically what do you have? You have a bunch of women sewing clothes, making ornaments, making cakes, or having a kind of a stove that will probably produce less smoke in the house, and so on. All of these make a little change in their lives, that's true. But all of them remain at the subsistence level. I have never seen income generating activities with, in which donor support, in which people have been able to get themselves much above a subsistence level of activity. When you support small and medium and micro enterprises, on the other hand, we have seen people get out of poverty and go much above. But the typical thing we call income generating activities have always kept people at a subsistence level. The other thing is that, it is as though you don't expect income generating activities to be successful. Because they never consider, if instead of 50 women, if you had 50,000 women doing the same thing, what would happen? Who would buy those cakes? Who would buy all the fried fish that they make? I mean, you watch this little group activity. So it is very different from this income generating activity that we have supported in the past. And finally, it is not what has been referred to as employment and job creation. And I have gone through that yesterday. You have that long list of the relationship at the policy level between a focus on employment and a focus on sustainable livelihood. That you have with you. So I don't have to go through that. That long table you have. Okay. Now I have tried to distinguish, you know what table I'm talking about, this one. Right? Now I have gone through both what sustainable livelihood is and what it is not. So hopefully it's starting to get clearer and clearer. Now, what do we do in the planning process? This is how it works. The outcome that we are seeking attempts to get straight, getting more footage. The outcome is sustainable livelihood. We have defined that. And everybody in this room can now easily articulate what is the meaning of sustainable livelihood. Right? So that we know very well. So we are trying to achieve that. That's the outcome. The entry point is local adaptive strategies. I've explained to you the whole issue of how people cope and adapt to shocks and stresses. Oh, when I talked about shocks and stresses, I gave you only one example. That example was at the household level. But I should have gone on to say that shocks and stresses can be political, and one of the major shocks and stresses throughout the developing world has been a policy shock. That policy shock has been structural adjustment. And Egypt is one of the countries that is cited as a classic success of structural adjustment. And maybe you are a major success story, but not many countries can claim success. The only two that I've heard of as success were Ghana in sub-Saharan Africa and Egypt. But when you speak to the Ghanaians, they tell you that that's the World Bank's feeling. But structural adjustment has done very different things to our poor people. Now today we will ask the Egyptians. And one is getting a few signals that maybe structural adjustment did have a very negative impact on the poor, while it probably helped some others in the society. So you can have policy shocks, political shocks, natural shocks, drought and flood. All of those shocks, people adjust to, they cope with, they adapt to. So we begin with people's assets, their knowledge base, their adaptive strategies. Not all adaptive strategies, because some are not going to be sustainable, like I explained. But those which have a greater chance of leading to sustainable livelihood, and how do we know which ones have a greater chance? We use those 4 sustainability criteria. Remember the 4 sustainability criteria: economic efficiency, social equity, ecological integrity, and the capacity to cope and recover. So that's the entry point. And we have guidebooks. We have, this is not circulated yet. These are a bunch of PRA tools focusing on assets, which we have here and which we will share. In other words, we have the guide on how you do this in the field, the specific tools that you use and how you do them. All these bricks and everything else, the PRA type stuff. And we have this is a copy of this book I told you about. It's called Participatory Research for Sustainable Livelihood. This is the book that a colleague and I did when we first did the first 4 years of experiments in those 5 countries. This is a documentation of that field experience. And that's available as well. So we have guides and tools on how do you do this. That is to say, how do you get people to start talking about their assets, their knowledge? You know, how do they do things? How have they done things for many years and so on. Now, how do we work on this base to produce that? That's the next step. And these are the 2 steps, which I'm called drivers, or the intervention points. How do you intervene so that you can improve people's assets? The big problem that we had when we started the assets approach was, people will look at us and say, but if people have assets, they cannot be poor. That was the problem. They are saying you are poor because you do not have assets. And we had a long time, it's not easy to get our colleagues to start understanding that you can have assets, but they are not either the right mix of assets, they are not very productive as they are, and so on. So how do we improve productivity, change the portfolio mix? That's the planning process. Increased access to assets, enhanced productivity of the asset base, change of the mix of the portfolio of assets. For example, if you had a lot of land, this is a classic country, I could give you 1 million hectares of the desert, and you might still be poor. But you can't eat it, you can't produce anything. But I might be able to give you that 1 million hectares of sand, and if there are some other things like marketing and other things, and people just love to come look at sand, you might become a millionaire from tourism without doing anything else. Or you might be able to get water, and then starting to make the desert productive. Like we know, one can make the desert highly productive. Then it's no longer a desert, and so on. So the challenge is, how do you make that asset base more productive? And how do people do it? And how do you help them to do that? That's the key. So we do that by 4 steps. Those 4 are, the first one is a policy analysis. You do the policy analysis to find out what policies prevent people from improving their own lives, and what policies can help them to improve their lives. That's the first thing. And the way you do that is by looking at that livelihood base and understanding the policy links. Let me give you an example of how macro policy is linked to the local level. The example is the case in Zimbabwe and Malawi. People used to grow corn, maize, millet, and sorghum. That's how they survived for hundreds of years. Millet and sorghum they refer to as small grain, and the corn is the larger grain. Okay. And they grew that, and they had that mix. Well, when the government intervened, it put in place what is called, many people know this, all economists know it, what was called an export growth model, export-led growth model. That is to say, you look at what the market wants overseas, and you put in place the macroeconomic incentives such as subsidies, tax relief, duty concessions, transport subsidies, storage facilities. All of these are macroeconomic incentives. These were put in place to stimulate the production of corn, because corn was demanded on the world market, and indeed in Africa. Other countries like Kenya and so on did not have enough corn. So having put all those macroeconomic incentives in place, people shifted, and people respond very rapidly to macroeconomic incentives. They shifted to production of corn, and they stopped growing sorghum and millet. And then the drought came. And corn cannot stand drought, as well as millet and sorghum. And we have famine in Zimbabwe and Malawi. Famine for years, from which they have not recovered. So what does this process say in that situation? It says, step 1, in the planning process, we would have studied how people coped and adapted to shock and stress over the years. And we would have found that they had evolved a mixture of millet, sorghum, and maize to cope with drought. Then we will say, but now we have to cope with the modern-day government planning process. And government would have said, no, that's fine. But this country has to develop. This country has to get a 5% per capita GNP every year. And to get that, agriculture must make a contribution of X%. We will say to the government, well, that's your choice. But our policy advice is the following, that you will have to take a trade-off. Reduce the contribution of agriculture to growth, but maintain a food security floor. In other words, you put in place a mixture of macroeconomic incentives which will reduce your contribution to growth, but maintain a food security floor. That's the link between the macro policy and the micro level reality. And we have, like I said, documented 10 volumes of how you link policy to local reality or the lives of the poor, such as livestock and agriculture and urban living and so on. Mainly, though, livestock and agriculture and rural. That's where we began our work, and now, as we know, we are moving into the urban. So that kind of analysis is not limited to agricultural policy. It has to cut over transport, macroeconomics, and so on. So it is cross-sectoral, and it is macro-micro linked. And we have a policy paper on how to start doing this. And that policy paper is available here as well, the first draft. Because we don't find consultants who can do that kind of analysis. We find consultants who are either macroeconomists or microeconomists, or they're land specialists or agricultural specialists, and some are planners who are not specialists in policy analysis and linkage. Okay. Some might be, but we don't find them easily, and we are searching for them. So if you know them, I'll be really happy to meet them, and we want to work with them. But we really have a need for that kind of people. The next level is, we were talking yesterday with John's presentation about what are those, or the day before, Sunday maybe, on those infrastructural things that only governments can provide us with. What we have found is that this word empowerment, you know, the word empowerment, I keep saying, is a nonsense word. It makes absolutely no sense, because nobody ever empowers anybody else. If you have power, empower means that I have power and I will give power to somebody who does not have. But that has never happened in the history of human civilization. What is possible is self-empowerment. All we can do as outsiders is to help create the conditions in which people must want to take power. We have a classic case in South Africa in which we are doing a lot of work. Because of apartheid for so many years, the black people, although the ANC is in power and they have just won 66.4% of the votes again, and Thabo Mbeki is swearing in tomorrow as the new president of South Africa, as you know, the poor black people in the villages, although they are in power, they are so demoralized that they just are waiting for people to give them things. They are not interested in taking power at the local level. Only the politicians and the educated people are talking about power in Pretoria. But at the local level, the want to empower yourself is lost. And that happened in Malawi as well, after 28 years. So the process of self-empowerment is crucial. And that self-empowerment only takes place by working at the local level and at the governmental level. You have to create this space through which people can get a greater say in their lives. When I talk about power, all I mean is empowerment or self-empowerment is the ability to have a greater control over your own life. That is, you have a greater say over the activities, the assets, and the entitlements through which you make your living. That's what I'm talking about. Okay? So the whole issue of empowerment and the relationship between local government and community-based organizations becomes very important. And let me make it explicitly clear. What we have learned is that the role of the NGO must change from providing services to people. The role that we foresee for the NGOs is where they build the capacity of CBOs to make demands from local governments and help to build the capacity of local government to meet those demands. And we will come in as a donor, and we will have to provide resources in order for local government to be able to meet the demands placed on them by the community. And that the role of central government is the same, to devolve resources and authority to the local government level to be able to meet the demands of the local people. That's what we are finding. Now, many governments have a policy of decentralization, but they don't transform that policy to action. That's not unusual, for various reasons, for political reasons and for capacity reasons. And we identify the role, for example, of an organization like UNDP to engage in a policy advocacy process to encourage government, central government, to devolve power to the local level, and also to put resources to help build that capacity. Now, if the government at the national level does not devolve either resources or responsibility to the local level, the SL approach is going to suffer badly. It is probably going to fail. And that's what we are finding. Hopefully, we might find some way to make it work. But this, we have found, is a crucial step. The other important part for you to keep in mind is that if you are successful and if people are in fact empowering themselves before long, they will clash with the elite, like landowners, like money lenders. Those traditional powerful people in the society will become very upset, and they will try to sabotage the process in indirect ways and in direct ways, such as their power to lobby the national government, their power, their ability to come together as a power group, and they will prevent the empowerment process from going forward. We've experienced that. Now, that's a real challenge. I am convinced, and people say you're a coward, you're taking the easier way out. When you begin this presentation, you sound like a revolutionary. Well, I'm not a revolutionary. I'm trying to be very pragmatic. I believe that poor people will not win the fight against the powerful people. Some of my colleagues, I think they're romantic, they believe they're revolutionaries, in which you can empower poor people to win that fight against the powerful. And instead, what my approach is, and several of my colleagues, when I say mine are many development practitioners, is how do we make power a positive sum game? That is to say, how can we convince those who already have power that if others get power, their power really increases, not decreases in the society? One example. Many governments in sub-Saharan Africa are afraid of the local population. They were taught forever that you have to keep these people poor and ignorant in order to control them. We are suggesting to them that you will be presiding over a bunch of non-productive people in a very poor country. If your country's wealth is improving, through the improvement in the lives of the poor, you are in fact a more powerful world player. You have more power and more respect at the international level. And in today's world, because of globalization, because of the nature of the international world, respect and the kind of power you command in international circles is extremely important to our leaders. And they're starting to listen. And that process hopefully will open up the space to move from confrontation to cooperation. And that's what we are hoping for. The two other drivers are technology and investment. And I will just make 2 or 3 points. So we have the strategy paper, which I will make available for you to read. But 2 or 3 key points. What are those points? The challenge of technology is not technology which is cheap and easy to maintain alone. We have always been told by the donors and by the Western world that in order to help poor people, what they need is cheap technology and technology that they can maintain. Well, this is important, but it's not the end of the story. The important thing is that the way technology is introduced from outside must be showing mutual respect for local technology. In other words, it's the participatory approach of getting the outside science and technology people, the big scientists and technologists, to recognize that the local people are equally good at science and technology, and to get the two to work together, and to work together with investment. Because you might have the best science and technology capability, and if you don't have the accompanying investment, it's not going to get anywhere. What do I mean by this? Let me give you an example to make it concrete. A traditional donor planning approach will say that in Bangladesh, in order to get communication of the remote villages, you will have to run all these telephone lines. Unless we have the telephone lines, unless we have access by phone, you can't do it. And in any event, these people are far, you have to get the traditional telephone system. Well, Mohammed Yunus, who is also the president of the Grameen Bank, said, I don't believe that. I don't think that the poor people in Bangladesh have to go through what we have gone through in history. We can leapfrog. We can jump the technology barrier. And what he did was to introduce cell phones directly to the poor people. Now everybody said, well, are you out of your mind? How are these poor people ever going to afford a cell phone? And that cell phone has to have a pretty powerful range. So he has to work with some advanced telecom companies in Germany to get this kind of range and the satellites and the antenna set up. Well, what he did and he said was, it's simple. You can only think of one cell phone per person, but we can think of one cell phone per village. So you get a loan one person takes a loan, gets the cell phone, many people use it and they pay for the service. That person is able to make a profit now, pay back the interest, make a profit, and everybody else has a service which is much cheaper than if they had a traditional phone. And we have leapfrogged the technology gap. If the technology criteria for planning follow the traditional approach, we would be having to spend billions of dollars in running telephone lines and copper wires all down the road. It's just one example that appropriate technology is not necessarily what is so-called cheap and easily maintainable technology. It can be very modern technology that the poor can use and benefit from. Let me make a small point about investment, 2 or 3 points. The first point is that the investment pattern followed by most developing countries and your planning process probably is influenced by structural adjustment and so on. Structural adjustment, what does it do? It seeks to contract domestic demand. In other words, Egyptians must eat less and eat cheaper food, spend less in real terms, in US dollar terms. You might be spending many more Egyptian funds. But the whole thing is to devalue your currency so that your purchasing power is reduced. But your export goods will be cheaper, and so you will earn more foreign exchange. That's a typical structural adjustment approach. Our investment strategy says that you have lots of domestic resources which you must focus on first. And that investment, those local resources, refer to all the assets we just talked about, including money. Here we are talking of what is called an investment-led structural transformation, rather than a structural adjustment process. And we have articulated and outlined clearly how do you mobilize domestic resources for investment. First, public investment. So the customs, the revenue base, the tax base, the debt capital. You look at all of those, how can you mobilize them and get them into the formal transaction process so that government will have more revenue to invest in health, in education, and in all of those services which contract during structural adjustment. In other words, we are talking of an expansion of government investment based largely on domestic resources rather than the reverse. And most people say, this is a poor country. Are you out of your mind? Where will government get more resources? Well, we are outlined a few strategies in which the domestic resource base can be expanded. In other words, I'm saying to you that as a planner, you might have a mindset which says you have no choice. Government will never be able to spend more. And government will not be able to spend more unless you are able to show how government can in fact mobilize more domestic resources. Where is the leakage? Where are the things we are not even touching yet? Where is this $280 billion in this country which is not being put to use? The report, a la Hernando Soto. Now I'm saying, look, Hernando Soto might be 100% wrong. In other words, half of what he says might be wrong. Let us assume that that is so. We still have $140 billion not at use. How can the planning process release that capital? That's your challenge. The other thing about investment is that's the change at the macro level. But it is extremely important that the planning process makes microfinance available as well. Now guard against, and I don't want to talk much about microfinance because that is so well known now and so many people are doing it right. The important contribution is to link that micro to the macro level. If you have a government policy which is encouraging hotels, encouraging outside investors to come because of tax holidays, because of all kinds of other incentives, people are coming in, but those incentives are going to give outsiders a better chance, not insiders. You will then get all your microfinance like income generating activities, they will always keep the poor at the subsistence level because the macro investment strategy gives them no space to grow. It is that harmonization whereby the local entrepreneur is going to be given some space in the macro investment level to grow, which will get people out of poverty. Because sustainable livelihoods are never subsistence livelihoods. Subsistence livelihoods are never sustainable. As soon as you get a shock, they will fall below the poverty line. And that is crucial. So when people talk of livelihoods, they tend to think only of local level activity. Our argument is that local level activity in a developing country will never lead to improved livelihoods and sustainable livelihoods. It will always be at the whim of international shock and national shock. So let me wrap up. The summary of the steps that I just pointed out to you are those 5. Right? And we can copy that page if it's going to be helpful. The participatory assessment, the policy level, the governance level, technology and investment. And these are integrated. Huh? That's what I just spent the last half an hour doing. That's just a summary of all of those. Then, what are the tools that we have? The tools that we have, what I'm calling tools, we have field manuals. I pointed out 2 or 3 of them. We have strategy papers, guidelines on how to do the policy step, how to do the governance step, how to do the investment step, how to do the technology step. We have all of those as tools. We have begun now, and we have a draft paper on indicators. What kinds of indicators do you use? And you have to use both the quantitative indicators and the participatory indicators. And we have a guideline showing what are some of these indicators and guidelines. The technology investment strategies. This PSD template is a program support document. UNDP is notorious for having very